They laughed at the toy army until it tricked Hitler's generals. June 15, 1944. Pentagon Building, Washington, D.C. The summer heat pressed against the windows of the third-floor conference room as Colonel Billy Harris stared at the rubber tank sitting on the table before him. He picked it up with one hand, all 60 pounds of it, and turned it over, examining the painted treads and molded gun barrel. Somewhere in France, real Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons and required 5-man crews. This thing looked like something his nephew might play with in the backyard. "You want me to take this to Europe?" Harris set the deflated tank down and looked across the table at Colonel Reeder, who didn't blink. "Not just you. We're assembling an entire unit. Artists, designers, sound engineers, some of the best creative minds in America." Reeder slid a folder across the polished wood. "The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Official strength, 1,100 men. Actual combat capability, 0. Harris opened the folder. Inside were personnel files, unlike any he'd seen. A fashion designer from New York, a sound engineer from Hollywood, an abstract painter who'd studied in Paris, a stage actor from Philadelphia. He looked up, incredulous. "Sir, with respect, the Wehrmacht isn't going to fall for inflatable tanks. They already have." Reeder pulled out a photograph from North Africa, a British operation called Operation Bertram. In the grainy black and white image, dummy tanks sat in neat rows. Montgomery used decoys at El Alamein in 42, fooled Rommel completely, made him think the main attack was coming from the south when it was really coming from the north. The deception helped us win the entire North African campaign. Harris studied the photo more carefully. From the air, even knowing they were fake, the tanks looked convincing. "The Germans rely on aerial reconnaissance," Reeder continued. "Luftwaffe pilots photograph our positions, count our armor, report back to headquarters. Their generals make decisions based on what those photos show them. But what if we could control what they see?" "You're talking about theater on a massive scale." "Exactly." Reeder stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "We've got the real invasion forces preparing for France. Thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, artillery divisions. But we can't be strong everywhere. We need the Germans looking the wrong direction, reinforcing the wrong positions, keeping their panzers away from our actual troops." Harris flipped through more files. Bill Blass, fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly, artist. Arthur Singer, wildlife illustrator. These weren't soldiers, they were creators. Men who understood visual deception and spatial design. "When do we ship out?" Harris asked. "Your unit assembles at Camp Forest, Tennessee, in 2 weeks. You'll have 4 months to train before deployment. Learn to inflate a dummy tank battalion in 2 hours. Make a Sherman sound like 1,000 Shermans. Create entire divisions out of thin air." Reeder returned to the table and looked Harris in the eye. "The Germans are going to count your inflatable army and move their real divisions to stop you. And while they're chasing ghosts, our actual forces will punch through somewhere else. You're going to save thousands of American lives by making the enemy kill toy soldiers." Harris looked down at the deflated tank again. It seemed impossibly fragile, impossibly foolish. But so had many things in this war before they changed everything. "What are we calling this unit officially?" "The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops." Reeder almost smiled. "But between us, they're already calling it the Ghost Army." September 3rd, 1944. Camp Forest, Tennessee. Private Jack Macy wiped paint from his hands and stepped back to examine his work. The canvas panel, stretched across a wooden frame, now bore the perfect replica of a 155mm howitzer. From 30 feet away, it looked real. From 300 feet, it was indistinguishable from the actual artillery piece sitting 200 yards across the training field. "Not bad for a fashion designer," said Lieutenant Fred Fox, walking up behind him. Fox himself had been an art director in New York before the war, designing window displays for Fifth Avenue department stores. Now, he directed the visual deception unit of the strangest company in the United States Army. "The shadow needs more depth," Macy said, squinting at his work. German reconnaissance planes photograph at 10,000 feet. The sun angle matters. If the shadow's wrong, photo interpreters will know it's fake. Around them, Camp Forest had transformed into a laboratory of deception. In one field, engineers practiced inflating rubber tanks using air compressors mounted on trucks. The entire process, driving up, unloading, inflating, positioning, and camouflaging a 4-tank platoon, had been timed at 42 minutes. Colonel Harris wanted it down to 30. In another area, sound engineers from the 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special ran through their equipment checks. Half-tracks mounted with massive loudspeakers sat in a row, each capable of projecting recorded sounds across miles. They'd spent weeks recording actual tank battalions at Fort Knox, the distinctive growl of Sherman engines, the metallic clank of treads, the rumble of convoys moving through mud. Now they could play it all back, creating the audio signature of an armored division where none existed. Sergeant Dick Syracuse, a former radio engineer from Pennsylvania, climbed onto one of the sound trucks and gestured to his crew. "Let's run the bridge crossing sequence again. I want perfect timing between the engine sounds and the tread sounds. When German listening posts pick this up, they should be able to close their eyes and see our tanks." The speakers crackled to life. First, the distant rumble of engines approaching. Then individual tanks growing louder, closer. The metallic clank of treads on wooden planks. The creaking of a pontoon bridge under weight. Syracuse listened with his eyes closed, mentally comparing it to the real thing he'd recorded. Something was off in the timing, maybe a half-second delay between engine noise and tread impact. "Again," he called. "Tighten the gap between tracks 3 and 4. Across the camp, the inflatable equipment inventory grew daily. Tanks, of course, Shermans and Stewarts in olive drab rubber, but also trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even airplanes. The Army had contracted with manufacturers to produce them. Rubber fabrication companies that normally made weather balloons and life rafts had retooled their production lines to create instruments of war that couldn't fire a single shot. In a warehouse at the camp's edge, Private Ellsworth Kelly, who would decades later become one of America's most celebrated abstract painters, supervised the application of camouflage patterns. He'd learned that the Germans used specific photo interpretation techniques, looking for patterns, shadows, and arrangements. So he studied those techniques and designed counter-patterns. "The Germans know how we typically position tank battalions," Kelly explained to a group of new arrivals. "They know our spacing, our defensive arrangements, our Lager formations. So we give them exactly what they expect to see. We make it look so real that questioning it seems unnecessary." He pointed to a layout diagram on the wall, a full tank battalion in defensive position. "See the spacing? 60 feet between vehicles, staggered in depth, fighting positions dug out. Every detail has to match what their intelligence manuals say we do. We're not just making fake tanks, we're creating a complete tactical picture." By October, the 23rd had refined their craft. They could deploy a dummy artillery battalion, 36 guns, in under 3 hours. The sound trucks could simulate a full armored division on the move. The radio operators in the signal company could create weeks of fake communications traffic, broadcasting the chatter of non-existent headquarters coordinating imaginary operations. They practiced at night, learning to work in darkness with minimal light. They rehearsed rapid deployment, racing against the clock to inflate an entire tank company before dawn. They studied Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, learning to think like German intelligence officers, analyzing reconnaissance photos. "Remember," Colonel Harris told them during a formation in late October, "you're not just soldiers. You're illusionists on the largest stage in the world. The audience is the German Wehrmacht, and if they believe your performance, American lives will be saved. If they don't believe it, your fellow soldiers will die, because enemy forces weren't where we wanted them." The men of the Ghost Army understood the stakes. In a few weeks, they'd ship out to Europe. The rehearsals would be over. The audience would be watching. And the performance would be measured not in applause, but in lives. January 26, 1945, near Trier, Germany. The frozen ground crunched under Lieutenant Fox's boots as he supervised the inflation of the first dummy tank on German soil. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees, and the rubber Sherman groaned and crackled as compressed air filled its chambers. In the darkness, illuminated only by heavily shielded flashlights, the tank took shape like some mechanical creature being born from canvas and rubber. "Faster," Fox urged his team. "We need all 16 tanks in position before dawn. That's 90 minutes." This was Operation Bouzonville, the Ghost Army's first mission on German territory, and the stakes had never been higher. While they created the illusion of 2 battalions massing near Trier, the actual 80th Infantry Division would launch the real attack 30 miles south. The Germans had to believe a major assault was coming here, believe it enough to reinforce this sector with troops that should have been elsewhere. Private Harold Dahl, an artist from Chicago, moved between the dummy tanks with cans of mud and snow, applying weathering effects that would be visible in dawn reconnaissance photos. A pristine tank was a suspicious tank. These needed to look like they'd been in position for days, dirt-splattered, partially camouflaged, showing the wear of field operations. 200 yards away, in a concealed position, Sergeant Syracuse and his sound crew prepared their acoustic assault. They'd positioned 3 speaker trucks in a triangle, each aimed at different German listening posts that intelligence had identified. At dawn, they'd play the recorded sounds of tank engines warming up, crews performing maintenance, and vehicles maneuvering into assault positions. "We're not just making noise," Syracuse reminded his crew. "We're telling a story. The Germans on the other side are combat veterans. They know what a real tank battalion sounds like. Timing, rhythm, the pattern of activity, it all has to be perfect." Captain Ralph Ingersoll, a journalist turned deception officer, stood in what would become the fake command post, watching radio operators set up their equipment. They would spend the next 48 hours broadcasting exactly the kind of message traffic a real division headquarters would generate: requests for supplies, weather reports, coordination with adjacent units, all in proper radio procedure and military format. "Use call signs from the 80th's actual radio net," Ingersoll instructed. "The Germans have been intercepting their traffic for weeks. They know the patterns. We want them to think the 80th has shifted north to this sector." By dawn, the illusion was complete. 16 tanks sat in tactical positions along the tree line. 3 artillery batteries, all inflatable, occupied fire positions in a nearby clearing. Trucks and half-tracks, their rubber forms inflated and camouflaged, filled a staging area. From the air, from German observation posts across the valley, it looked like an entire combat team preparing for a major assault on Trier. At 0630 hours, the sound show began. The rumble of Sherman engines echoed across the valley. Tank treads clanked. Voices shouted orders, all recorded, all perfectly timed, all projected through speakers powerful enough to be heard 2 miles away in German positions. In a bunker on the German side, Hauptmann Werner Kleist of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division pressed his field telephone to his ear and reported to his battalion commander. "Heavy tank activity north of our position. Estimate battalion strength, possibly more. Engine sounds consistent with American M4S. Request immediate reinforcement." Exactly what the Ghost Army wanted him to say. For 2 days, the Ghost Army maintained their performance. They moved dummy tanks to new positions at night, creating the impression of tactical adjustments. The sound trucks varied their programming, sometimes maintenance activity, sometimes movement, creating a dynamic picture of a force preparing for combat. Radio operators generated hundreds of messages, building the fiction of a division headquarters coordinating a major operation. German artillery responded predictably. Shells began falling on dummy positions. Each explosion that tore apart a rubber tank instead of a real one validated the deception. Each German artillery shell wasted here was one that wouldn't fall on actual American troops 30 miles south. On January 28th, the real 80th Infantry Division launched their assault. German commanders, expecting the attack near Trier, had reinforced the wrong sector. By the time they realized the deception, American forces had broken through, weakly defended positions, and were driving deep into German territory. The Ghost Army deflated their rubber props, loaded their trucks, and disappeared before German forces could adjust. They left behind only shell craters where fake tanks had stood, and the growing suspicion among German intelligence officers that something very strange was happening with American deployments. "How many did we save?" Private Macy asked Lieutenant Fox as they packed the last dummy tank into its carrying case. Fox looked toward the south, where the actual battle was being fought. "We'll never know exactly, but somewhere over there, American soldiers are alive, because the shells meant for them hit our rubber instead. That's the only review that matters." March 18th, 1945. Near Viersen, Germany, the Rhine River. The Rhine stretched before them like a steel-gray ribbon, 400 yards of cold water that had protected Germany's heartland for 1,000 years. Lieutenant Fox stood on the western bank, binoculars raised, studying the far shore where German positions bristled with machine guns, mortars, and the deadly 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could destroy a tank with a single shot. "This is the big one," Colonel Harris said, joining him at the observation post. "Operation Viersen. Monty's 21st Army Group crosses here in 4 days. We need every German division within 50 miles looking at us instead of at the real crossing sites." Fox lowered his binoculars. The Ghost Army had executed over 20 deceptions since landing in France, but nothing approached this scale. They would simulate 2 full divisions, 30,000 men, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces massing for a major assault crossing. The illusion had to be perfect because British and Canadian forces were counting on it. By nightfall, the transformation began. Trucks rolled in carrying hundreds of inflatable tanks. Sound equipment that had been carefully maintained through 9 months of operations was positioned at key points. Radio operators established an entire communications network for divisions that existed only on paper, and the visual deception specialists began creating what would become their masterpiece. Private Kelly had spent weeks planning the layout. "German photo interpreters are sophisticated," he explained to his team. "They look for inconsistencies, for things that don't make tactical sense. So every element, every tank, every artillery piece, every supply dump has to be positioned exactly where doctrine says it should be." He pointed to a massive planning map spread across a table. "The dummy 30th Division goes here, arranged for a deliberate river crossing. The fake 79th Division supports from here. We're showing them a textbook assault plan, so textbook that questioning it seems pointless." The inflation teams worked through the night in rotating shifts. By dawn on March 19th, the landscape had transformed. Where empty fields had stood, now sat a vast military encampment. Rubber tanks clustered in assembly areas. Inflatable artillery pieces occupied firing positions, their barrels aimed across the Rhine. Dummy trucks and half-tracks filled staging areas. Camouflage netting, carefully positioned, suggested units trying to hide from aerial reconnaissance while being just visible enough to be spotted. But the visual deception was only half the performance. Sergeant Syracuse orchestrated the audio component like a conductor leading an orchestra. He'd positioned 9 speaker trucks in a careful arrangement, each assigned specific roles in the acoustic illusion. "The Germans can triangulate sound," Syracuse briefed his team. "They've got listening posts all along the Rhine, and they're good at their jobs. So we give them sounds coming from where real units would be, not random noise, a pattern that tells a story." At dawn, the sounds began. Tank engines starting in sequence, first one company, then another, then another. The roar building as an armored battalion came to life. The clank of treads on frozen ground. The rumble of supply convoys moving up. The distinctive sounds of engineers assembling pontoon bridges hammering. The splash of bridge sections entering water. The shouts of work crews. Private Macy, now a veteran of dozens of deceptions, added the finishing touches to a dummy supply dump. Stacked crates canvas stretched over wooden frames that, from a distance, looked like ammunition and rations. He'd even added carelessly discarded packing materials, the kind of mess real soldiers would leave. "The devil's in the details," he muttered, arranging debris in a pattern that looked natural, unplanned. real. The radio deception reached new heights of sophistication. Captain Ingersoll's communications specialists generated an avalanche of message traffic maintenance reports, personnel rosters, supply requests, weather updates, coordination with adjacent units. They used proper call signs, proper procedures, proper timing. The electromagnetic spectrum hummed with the chatter of divisions preparing for a massive assault. Across the Rhine, German intelligence officers analyzed the growing body of evidence. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed massive force concentration near Viersen. Listening posts reported the sounds of two divisions massing for attack. Signal intelligence intercepted radio traffic from headquarters elements, coordinating a major river crossing. Ground observers reported seeing tank formations, artillery batteries, and supply dumps. Every intelligence indicator pointed to the same conclusion. The Americans were preparing to force the Rhine at Viersen. General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, commanding the sector, requested reinforcements. The Americans are massing at Viersen, estimate 2 divisions, possibly more. This appears to be a major crossing attempt. Request immediate commitment of the 116th Panzer Division. Wehrmacht headquarters, stretched thin across a collapsing front, made the calculation they moved precious reserves north to Viersen, pulling forces away from sectors where British and Canadian divisions were actually preparing to cross. For 3 days, the Ghost Army maintained their illusion. They adjusted positions at night, simulating tactical preparations. The sound show continued varying schedules and patterns to match what a real force would do. Radio traffic reflected the increasing tempo of pre-assault preparations. On March 23rd, British and Canadian forces launched their actual crossing, Operation Plunder. At multiple points 20 miles from Viersen, they encountered resistance, but not the concentrated armored forces that should have been there. The German reserves that might have stopped them were dug in near Viersen, waiting for an American assault that would never come. When the Ghost Army finally withdrew, German observers watched in confusion as the massive American force seemed to vanish. Reconnaissance patrols sent across the Rhine found abandoned positions, the pressed-down grass where tanks had supposedly sat, but no actual equipment, just strange rubber debris and the distinctive smell of canvas and paint. In a headquarters bunker, a German intelligence officer stared at the reconnaissance report and said 3 words that summed up the Ghost Army's entire mission. They fooled us. By the time Wehrmacht command realized they'd been deceived, Allied forces had established bridgeheads across the Rhine. The war in Germany entered its final phase, and thousands of Allied soldiers who might have died fighting concentrated German reserves were instead alive, pushing east. The Ghost Army rolled up their inflatable props and moved to their next assignment. They'd performed their greatest deception yet, and the audience, the Wehrmacht, had believed every moment of it. April 14th, 1945. Near Luxembourg City, spring rain hammered against the canvas cover of the truck as Private Kelly packed away the last of the camouflage netting. Around him, the Ghost Army conducted what would be one of their final operations, a tactical deception near Luxembourg, simulating a division to draw German attention from actual Allied advances deeper into Germany. But the war was ending. Everyone could feel it. The elaborate deceptions that had saved thousands of lives since Normandy were becoming less necessary as German resistance collapsed. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in Europe, was disintegrating under the weight of Allied advances from the west and Soviet forces from the east. Lieutenant Fox walked through the dummy tank positions one last time, rain dripping from his helmet. Each rubber Sherman sat in perfect tactical position, carefully camouflaged, waiting for German reconnaissance that might never come. After nearly 20 operations spanning from France into the heart of Germany, the routine was second nature, but this felt different, final. Orders just came through, Colonel Harris announced at the evening briefing. This is our last deception operation. Once we complete this mission, the 23rd stands down from tactical operations. The room fell quiet. For months, these men, artists, designers, actors, sound engineers turned soldiers, had lived with the knowledge that their fake warfare was saving real lives. Now that mission was ending. I want you to understand what we accomplished, Harris continued. Intelligence estimates that our operations misdirected German forces in over 20 major actions. We simulated divisions that pulled real Wehrmacht units away from actual Allied attacks. We created threats that caused the enemy to waste ammunition, to commit reserves to the wrong sectors, to make tactical decisions based on false information. He paused, looking at the assembled men. There's no precise way to measure how many American, British, and Canadian soldiers are alive because we fooled the Germans. But I believe it's thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Sergeant Syracuse sat in his sound truck, running diagnostics on equipment that had operated through rain, snow, and the chaos of mobile warfare. The speakers that had projected the sounds of phantom tank divisions across Europe would soon fall silent. He thought about all the German soldiers who'd reported hearing American armor moving in the darkness, who'd called for reinforcements, who'd repositioned their forces based on audio illusions. We were like a radio play, he told his crew, except the audience thought it was real, and believing it changed where they put their troops. The final deception ran for 3 days. Dummy tanks sat in their positions. Sound trucks played their recordings. Radio operators broadcast their traffic. But German response was minimal. The Wehrmacht was fighting for survival now, retreating from overwhelming Allied pressure. The luxury of responding to every perceived threat had vanished. On April 16th, the Ghost Army deflated their rubber tanks for the last time. The inflation crews, who'd mastered the art of erecting entire battalions in under an hour, now packed the equipment away with a strange sense of loss. These absurd weapons, rubber and canvas and compressed air, had proven more powerful than anyone had believed possible. Private Maisie stood before a dummy Sherman, one he'd personally weathered and camouflaged for a dozen operations. "You know what's crazy?" he said to Kelly. "A year ago, this seemed like the stupidest idea in the world. Rubber tanks, recorded sounds, thinking we could fool the Germans with toys. And we did. We actually did it." Kelly nodded, thinking about all the times German artillery had destroyed their dummy positions, all the shells that had torn apart rubber instead of killing real soldiers. "We weaponized art," he said. "We turned illusion into something that saved lives." The Ghost Army's official casualty count for their entire service in Europe: 0 men killed by enemy action. But their impact on German tactical decisions, on enemy force dispositions, on the survival of countless Allied soldiers, that was immeasurable. As they drove away from their final operation, moving into Germany's interior, where American forces were mopping up remaining resistance, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops carried with them a unique distinction. They'd fought an entire war without firing a shot. They'd defeated German divisions with rubber and canvas and speakers. They'd proven that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the ones that explode, they're the ones that deceive. May 8, 1945. Baumholder, Germany. Victory in Europe Day arrived with a strange quietness for the men of the Ghost Army. While other units celebrated in the streets, toasting the defeat of Nazi Germany, the men of the 23rd mostly felt a profound sense of anticlimax. Their war had been fought in shadows and deceptions, victories measured in enemy decisions rather than territory captured. Lieutenant Fox sat in the orderly room, beginning the paperwork that would document their operations. But even that presented challenges. How do you write an after-action report for battles that never happened? How do you document enemies defeated by illusions? "The armies ordered us to classify everything," Colonel Harris told him. "All operational records, all techniques, all equipment specifications. Top secret classification, indefinite duration." Fox looked up from his typewriter. "Why?" "The war's over, because the techniques still work," Harris replied. "Command believes tactical deception will be valuable in future conflicts. They don't want potential enemies knowing exactly how we fooled the Germans." So the Ghost Army story was locked away. The men were ordered not to discuss their service, not to reveal the nature of their operations, not to tell the story of how artists and designers had saved thousands of lives through creative deception. They'd helped win the war, but they'd have to do it silently. Private Kelly packed his artwork sketches of dummy tanks, camouflage patterns, tactical layouts. Someday, he thought, maybe these could be shown. Maybe people would understand that art and warfare aren't always opposites, that creativity can be a weapon as surely as a rifle. Sergeant Syracuse supervised the inventory of sound equipment, hundreds of hours of recordings, technical innovations in audio projection, sophisticated techniques for creating three-dimensional soundscapes, all of it classified, all of it filed away in archives that wouldn't be opened for decades. "We changed warfare," he told his crew as they loaded the last equipment onto trucks. "We proved that information warfare, making the enemy believe false things, can be as effective as firepower, but nobody will know about it." The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops officially deactivated on September 15, 1945. The men returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they couldn't share. Bill Blass went back to fashion design, eventually becoming one of America's most celebrated designers. Ellsworth Kelly returned to painting, his abstract works eventually hanging in major museums worldwide. Arthur Singer illustrated wildlife guides. The sound engineers returned to radio and film production. They'd gather occasionally, these veterans of a secret war, and talk in vague terms about that time in Europe, without revealing specifics. Their families knew they'd served, but not how. Their friends knew they'd been in the war, but not what they'd done. German records, captured and analyzed by Allied intelligence, revealed the full scope of their success. Wehrmacht after-action reports documented numerous decisions based on Ghost Army deceptions. Divisions had been moved to counter fake threats. Artillery had been wasted on dummy positions. Tactical plans had been built around false intelligence. The Americans, the Germans concluded, had somehow learned to make armies appear and disappear like phantoms. One captured German intelligence report, analyzed by Allied officers after the war, stated simply, American deception capabilities appeared to include the creation of entire divisions through unknown means. Recommend all force estimates be treated with extreme caution. The Ghost Army had done their job so well that German intelligence stopped trusting their own reconnaissance. The economic cost of the Ghost Army was negligible, roughly $3 million for equipment and operations. The cost of the actual divisions they simulated would have been billions. The lives they saved were priceless. But the story remained classified. Through the Cold War, through Korea, through Vietnam, the Ghost Army's operations stayed locked in classified archives. Occasional mentions appeared in military journals, vague references to tactical deception units in World War II, but the details remained secret. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after VE Day, that the Ghost Army's records were finally declassified. Historians could finally piece together the full story of how 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers had fooled Hitler's generals with rubber and canvas and compressed air. By then, many of the Ghost Army veterans had passed away, their service still unknown to most. But those who survived to see declassification finally got to tell their story. They appeared in documentaries, gave interviews, wrote memoirs. The art they'd created, camouflage patterns, dummy tank designs, tactical layouts, was displayed in museums as both military history and artistic achievement. Present day. The Ghost Army story, once locked in classified archives, now serves as a testament to creative problem-solving in warfare. Military academies study their operations as examples of asymmetric warfare, achieving strategic objectives through deception rather than firepower. The techniques they pioneered influenced modern military doctrine on information warfare and tactical deception. The rubber tanks and sound equipment that seemed so absurd in 1944 proved a concept that remains relevant. Controlling what your enemy believes can be as important as controlling terrain. The Ghost Army demonstrated that a small force using deception could have strategic impact far beyond their actual size. Modern military deception operations trace their intellectual lineage directly to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The integration of visual, audio, and radio deception into coordinated campaigns, the attention to detail in creating believable illusions, the understanding that enemy intelligence officers could be influenced through carefully crafted false evidence. All these concepts that the Ghost Army validated are now fundamental elements of military planning. But perhaps their most important legacy is simply the reminder that creativity and warfare aren't mutually exclusive. The men of the Ghost Army weren't traditional soldiers, they were artists who learned military tactics, designers who studied enemy intelligence procedures, sound engineers who became experts in tactical psychology. They approached warfare as a creative problem, and in doing so, they saved lives. The paintings and sketches created by Ghost Army members now hang in military museums alongside photographs of their inflatable creations. The contrast is striking. Delicate watercolors next to massive rubber tanks, abstract art beside tactical deception plans. It's a visual reminder that the same creative impulse that produces beauty can also produce strategic advantage. Veterans groups have worked to ensure the Ghost Army receives recognition for their service. In 2024, 80 years after D-Day, the Ghost Army was collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. The citation noted their unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations that saved countless American lives. For the surviving veterans who attended the ceremony, the recognition came with mixed emotions. They were proud of what they'd accomplished, but they remembered fallen comrades from other units, men who died in actual combat while the Ghost Army fought with illusions. They knew their rubber tanks and recorded sounds had worked because real soldiers were on real battlefields, fighting real battles. "We didn't win the war," said one elderly veteran at the ceremony, one of the last surviving members of the 23rd. "We just helped tilt the odds a bit. We made the Germans look the wrong way sometimes, commit their forces to the wrong places, but it was the real soldiers, the infantry and armor and artillery, who actually won. We were just stagehands in a very large production." But what a production it was! 21 major operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Hundreds of dummy tanks inflated and deflated. Thousands of hours of sound effects broadcast. Millions of radio messages transmitted. An entire phantom army that existed only in German intelligence reports and American imagination, yet influenced the course of battles and the survival of soldiers. The story of the Ghost Army reminds us that warfare has always been as much about psychology as firepower, as much about perception as reality. The Wehrmacht made decisions based on what they believed about American force dispositions. The Ghost Army controlled those beliefs. In that sense, they fought a war of ideas, and they won it. Today, when military historians analyze the liberation of Europe, they include the Ghost Army's operations alongside the major battles and campaigns. Operation Viersen's deception at the Rhine takes its place next to the actual river crossings it protected. The dummy tank battalions that drew German fire in France are remembered alongside the real armor divisions that broke through German lines. The men who once worried they'd be dismissed as playing with toys in wartime are now recognized as innovators who expanded the definition of combat effectiveness. They proved that 1,100 men with rubber and canvas could have the strategic impact of entire divisions. They demonstrated that art and warfare could combine to save lives. The Ghost Army never fired a shot in anger. They never stormed a beach, never captured a town, never held a defensive position against enemy assault. But they fought nonetheless with brushes and speakers and inflatable props. They created an army of ghosts that haunted German headquarters and influenced enemy decisions across Europe. And in the end, perhaps that's the most remarkable part of their story, that in humanity's most destructive war, a group of artists and designers found a way to save lives through creativity rather than destruction. They prove that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that kills, it's the one that deceives, so effectively that killing becomes unnecessary. The Ghost Army's phantom tanks are gone now, deflated and disposed of decades ago. The recordings of engine sounds have degraded. The radio equipment is obsolete. But the idea they represented, that imagination and deception can change the course of warfare, remains as relevant as ever. In an age of information warfare and cyber operations, the Ghost Army's fundamental insight still holds. Control what your enemy believes, and you control their decisions. That's the lasting legacy of the men who laughed at rubber tanks and then used them to fool Hitler's generals. They changed warfare by proving that the most powerful force on a battlefield might not be the biggest gun. It might be the most convincing illusion.